You think you're unhappy because life hasn't given you enough. Not enough success, not enough love, not enough certainty. But what if that's not true? What if the real reason you feel this constant, quiet dissatisfaction is not because life is lacking, but because you have already decided somewhere deep inside how much happiness you are allowed to feel? Most people never question this. They move through life believing that happiness is something external, something earned, something that arrives only after the right conditions are met. But the truth is far more unsettling. You are not chasing happiness. You are orbiting a limit, a silent, invisible boundary that you rarely notice but always obey. Think about it. There are people who achieve everything they once dreamed of: money, recognition, relationships, and yet they still feel the same low-level emptiness they felt before. And there are others who have very little, yet move through life with a calm, grounded sense of peace. This isn't random. This isn't luck. This is internal calibration, a psychological set point, a level of happiness that your mind has quietly accepted as normal, and anything above it begins to feel unfamiliar, even uncomfortable. And when something feels unfamiliar, the mind doesn't expand to meet it, it resists it. It pulls you back. So even when life starts to improve, even when things begin to go your way, something inside you tightens. You start to overthink, you start to doubt, you start to feel like something is wrong. Not because anything actually is, but because you are drifting above the level of happiness you've been conditioned to tolerate. And without realizing it, you begin to correct it. You lower your expectations. You sabotage your progress. You return to what feels familiar, not what is good, but what is known. This is why some people can never stay happy for long. Not because they are cursed, not because life is against them, but because they have unconsciously decided the maximum amount of happiness they believe they deserve, and they keep returning to it again and again. The most dangerous part, this limit does not feel like a choice. It feels like reality. It feels like this is just how life is, but it isn't. It is how your mind has been trained to interpret life. And until you see that, you will keep trying to change your life without ever realizing that the real constraint was never outside of you. It was always the line you drew within. There is something most people never notice about themselves. No matter what happens in their life, good or bad, they always seem to return to a familiar emotional state. It might take days, weeks, sometimes months, but eventually they drift back to the same level of satisfaction, the same level of stress, the same quiet baseline they have always lived in. This is not coincidence. This is not fate. This is what you could call your invisible limit, the internal line your mind has drawn for how much happiness is normal for you. You can see this pattern everywhere once you become aware of it. Someone gets a promotion, earns more money, upgrades their lifestyle, and for a short moment they feel elevated, excited, fulfilled. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, that feeling fades. The new life becomes ordinary. The excitement dissolves into routine, and they find themselves thinking the same thoughts they used to think before. It's still not enough. On the other side, someone goes through a difficult time, loss, failure, uncertainty, and yet, after some time, they stabilize. They don't stay at the lowest point forever. They return to their baseline. It is as if the mind is constantly pulling them back to a set emotional temperature. This is your psychological set point, your emotional home. And everything in your life, no matter how extreme it may seem, gets filtered through it. If something pushes you above it, you feel tension. If something drops you below it, you feel discomfort. And without realizing it, your mind is always working to bring you back to that familiar middle. Not because it is the best place for you, but because it is the safest. It is what you know. This is why gaining more does not guarantee feeling better, because the feeling is not created by what you gain, it is regulated by what you are used to. If your internal standard for happiness is low, then even a good life will feel insufficient. If your internal standard is unstable, then even moments of peace will feel temporary, fragile, almost suspicious. You will start looking for problems even when there are none, simply because your mind is trying to restore what feels familiar. And this is where it becomes dangerous, because this limit is invisible. You never question it. You don't see it as a constraint, you see it as reality. You say, this is just how life is. You believe that dissatisfaction is natural, that restlessness is normal, that something always has to be missing, but what you are actually experiencing is not life itself, it is your conditioned response to life. Imagine carrying a glass that can only hold a certain amount of water. No matter how much more you pour into it, anything beyond its capacity will spill over. Now, replace the glass with your mind. Your capacity for happiness is not fixed by the world, it is defined by what you have trained yourself to hold. And right now, whether you realize it or not, you are living inside that capacity. So the question is no longer, why am I not happier? The real question is, what level of happiness have I unconsciously decided is enough for me? And more importantly, what happens when life begins to offer you more than that? That invisible limit didn't appear out of nowhere. You weren't born with it. You learned it slowly, quietly, over time, until it became part of how you see yourself, how you interpret life, and how much happiness you believe you are allowed to feel. It started earlier than you think, before you had language for it, before you could question it. As a child, you were constantly absorbing signals from the world around you, not just what people said, but how they behaved, how they reacted, what they rewarded, what they ignored. You were learning, without realizing it, what was safe to feel and what was not. If joy was met with indifference, you learned to tone it down. If confidence was met with criticism, you learned to shrink. If expressing yourself led to rejection, you learned to hold back. And if happiness felt unstable, if it could be taken away at any moment, you learned not to trust it too much, not to go too far into it, not to rely on it. Over time, these experiences formed patterns. And those patterns became beliefs, quiet, internal sentences that began to define your emotional boundaries. Don't get too excited. This won't last. Something will go wrong. You don't deserve more than this. You may not consciously repeat these thoughts, but they are there running in the background, shaping how you respond to everything that happens. And the world reinforces them. Society doesn't teach you to expand your capacity for peace. It teaches you to chase more. More success, more validation, more comparison. You are surrounded by messages that tell you happiness is always somewhere else, always one step ahead. So even when you have enough, it never feels like enough, because your internal standard was never built to recognize enough in the first place. This is how the limit becomes invisible. It blends into your identity. It becomes just who you are. You say things like, I'm just not a happy person, or I overthink everything, or I can't relax. But these are not fixed traits. They are learned responses, conditioned patterns that have been repeated so many times they now feel permanent. And here is where it gets even more subtle. When your life begins to improve, when things start to align, when you finally experience moments of calm, stability, even genuine happiness, something inside you doesn't fully accept it. Not because you don't want it, but because it doesn't match the internal script you've been living by. It feels unfamiliar, and unfamiliar to the mind often feels unsafe. So instead of settling into that new level, you begin to question it. You analyze it. You look for cracks in it. You prepare for it to disappear. You might even feel a strange discomfort in moments that should feel peaceful. And without realizing it, you start pulling yourself back into the emotional state you've known for years. Not because it is better, but because it is familiar. This is the true power of conditioning. It doesn't force you. It doesn't control you from the outside. It becomes you. It shapes what you believe is normal, what you believe is possible, and most importantly, what you believe you deserve. And until you see that clearly, until you understand that your current level of happiness is not a reflection of your life, but a reflection of your programming, you will keep trying to fix your circumstances while the real structure shaping your experience remains untouched. Once this programming is in place, it doesn't just sit quietly in the background, it starts to act. It begins to shape your behavior in ways that are almost invisible to you. And this is where the real problem begins, because you are no longer just limited by your beliefs, you are actively participating in keeping yourself there. This is what self-sabotage really is. Not some dramatic act of destruction, not a conscious decision to ruin your life. It is far more subtle than that. It is the quiet, automatic tendency to disrupt anything that rises above your internal limit. It happens in moments that should feel like progress. You meet someone who treats you well, better than you're used to. At first it feels good, but then something shifts. You start to question their intentions. You look for flaws. You create distance. You lose interest, not because they changed, but because the level of emotional safety they offer does not match what you are used to. So you unconsciously move away from it. Or you get an opportunity, a real one, a step forward. And instead of stepping into it fully, you hesitate, you delay, you overthink every detail. You tell yourself you need more time, more preparation, more certainty. And slowly, the opportunity fades. Again, not because you weren't capable, but because stepping into that version of yourself would require you to exist above your current emotional set point. Even success can become uncomfortable. When things are going well, when you are making progress, when you feel stable, when life finally seems calm, there is a strange tension that begins to build. It's subtle, but it's there. A sense that something is off, that this won't last, that you should be preparing for something to go wrong. And so you create the very disruption you fear. You pick unnecessary fights. You make impulsive decisions. You abandon consistency. You return to old habits, not because you want chaos, but because chaos is familiar. It fits the emotional pattern you've been living in for years. And your mind, above all else, prioritizes what is familiar over what is beneficial. This is why intelligence doesn't save you from self-sabotage. You can understand your problems perfectly and still repeat them. Because this is not a logical process. It is emotional conditioning. Your mind is not asking what is best for me. It is asking what feels like me. And if peace does not feel like you, you will reject it. If stability does not feel like you will disrupt it. If happiness does not feel like you will quietly move away from it, even as you say you want it. This is the paradox most people never resolve. They spend years trying to build a better life while unconsciously maintaining the emotional identity that prevents them from living it. They think the problem is external, wrong people, wrong timing, wrong circumstances. But the pattern follows them everywhere because it is not in their environment, it is in their response. And the more they try to fix things outside, the more frustrated they become. Because no matter how much they improve their situation, they keep returning to the same internal state. Not because they are incapable of change, but because they have never questioned the version of themselves they keep returning to. Self-sabotage is not failure, it is consistency. It is the mind doing exactly what it has been trained to do, protect a familiar identity, even if that identity is limiting, even if it is painful. And until you see this clearly, you will keep calling it bad luck. You will keep calling it timing. You will keep calling it circumstances, when in reality it is simply the part of you that does not yet believe you are allowed to live beyond the level you've always known. Most people see this pattern, this cycle of never quite feeling satisfied, and they come to a simple conclusion. They believe the answer is to get more success, more money, more recognition. more control. They assume that if they can just improve their external life enough, something inside them will finally settle. But this is where the illusion becomes dangerous, because external progress does not automatically change your internal capacity to experience it. You can build a better life and still feel the same. You can reach goals you once thought would change everything and still wake up with the same underlying restlessness, the same quiet tension, the same feeling that something is missing even when objectively very little is. This is why so many people become trapped in a loop of chasing. They achieve something, feel a temporary high, and then return to their baseline. And instead of questioning the baseline, they assume the goal wasn't big enough, so they chase something bigger, and the cycle repeats. Not because they are greedy, not because they are ungrateful, but because they are trying to fix an internal limit with external results, and it never works. You see it in people who have everything society tells you should make you happy: financial freedom, status, options, and yet internally they are no different from who they were before. The same thoughts, the same insecurities, the same emotional patterns, just with a more comfortable environment around them. Because achievement changes your circumstances, but it does not change your relationship with those circumstances. If your internal standard is built on tension, then even success will feel unstable. If your mind is conditioned to expect problems, then even peace will feel temporary. You will sit in a moment that should feel complete, and your mind will immediately start searching for what could go wrong, and slowly, almost without noticing, you will disconnect from the very thing you worked so hard to create. This is the difference most people never understand. There is a gap between what you have and what you allow yourself to feel. You can have more and feel less. You can achieve more and experience nothing. Because the experience is not created by the thing itself, it is created by the meaning your mind gives to it. And if your mind is still operating within the same old limit, then no amount of external change will feel like enough. This is why chasing happiness as a result of achievement keeps you stuck. Because it assumes that happiness is something that will arrive from the outside, when in reality it is something that is either permitted or restricted from within, and until that changes, you will keep moving forward in life while emotionally staying in the same place, not because you're not progressing, but because your capacity to experience that progress has never expanded. At this point, you might begin to see something clearly for the first time. The problem was never the world. It was never the timing, the people, or the circumstances. It was the way your mind has been trained to interpret all of it. This is where Stoic philosophy becomes brutally honest, because it removes every illusion you've been holding on to. It tells you something most people are not ready to accept. Nothing outside of you has the power to determine your inner state unless you allow it. Not events, not outcomes, not other people, only your perception of them. This is the shift that changes everything. Because once you understand that your experience of life is not created by what happens, but by how you interpret what happens, you stop waiting for the world to change before you feel different. You realize that the same situation can feel completely different depending on the lens you look through. One person sees failure and feels destroyed. Another sees the same failure and feels sharpened. One person experiences silence and feels lonely. Another experiences silence and feels at peace. The difference is not in the event. The difference is in the mind that receives it. And your mind has been trained over years to default to a certain interpretation, a certain emotional response, a certain level of meaning. That is your conditioning. That is your limit. But here is the part most people miss. If your perception is learned, then it can also be changed. Not instantly, not effortlessly, but deliberately. The Stoics understood this deeply. They did not try to control the world because they knew that was impossible. Instead, they trained themselves to control their judgments, their reactions, their internal dialogue. They understood that suffering is not simply a result of what happens, but a result of the story you attach to what happens. And if the story changes, the experience changes. This is why two people can live in completely different realities while standing in the exact same place. Because reality, as you experience it, is filtered through the structure of your mind. And if that structure is built on limitation, then even a good life will feel insufficient. But if that structure is built on clarity, discipline, and control, then even a difficult life can feel stable. This is the truth that breaks the cycle. You are not limited by what happens to you. You are limited by the meaning you continuously give to it. And that meaning is not fixed. It is practiced, reinforced, repeated every single day. So the question is no longer, why is my life like this? The question becomes, why does my mind keep interpreting life this way? Because once you ask that, you are no longer a victim of your experience. You become the one shaping it. There comes a moment quiet, almost unnoticeable, when everything begins to shift. Not because your life suddenly changes, but because you start to see something you couldn't see before. You begin to realize that the patterns you thought were just how things are actually patterns you've been repeating. You begin to notice that the same emotional reactions show up again and again in different situations, with different people, but with the same intensity, the same outcome. And for the first time, you stop blaming what's happening outside of you, and you start observing what's happening within you. This is awareness, and it is the point where the cycle begins to break. Because as long as something remains unconscious, it controls you. But the moment you can see it clearly, it starts to lose its power. You start catching yourself in real time. You notice the moment your mind begins to assume the worst. You notice the tension rising when things are going well. You notice the impulse to overthink, to doubt, to pull back. And instead of immediately reacting, you pause. Not to fix it, not to fight it, just to see it. This is where real change begins, not in action, but in observation. Because you cannot change what you are not aware of, and most people are not aware of how deeply their own patterns run. They think they are responding to life, when in reality, they are repeating themselves. Awareness creates distance, and in that distance, something new becomes possible. You are no longer completely identified with every thought, every feeling, every reaction. You begin to see them as processes, not truths, as patterns, not identity. And this is uncomfortable at first, because it removes the certainty you've been living in. It challenges the story you've been telling yourself about who you are and why your life feels the way it does. But it also gives you something you didn't have before: choice. Not the illusion of control over everything, but the quiet, powerful ability to choose how you engage with your own mind. You begin to understand that you don't have to follow every thought to its conclusion. You don't have to believe every assumption your mind produces. You don't have to return to the same emotional state just because it feels familiar. And in that realization, something opens. You are no longer trapped inside the limit, you are observing it. And once you can observe it, you are already no longer fully controlled by it. Once you reach this point, once you can see the pattern, observe it, and separate yourself from it, the question is no longer whether change is possible. The question becomes, how do you begin to move beyond the limit you've been living inside for so long? And this is where most people make a critical mistake. They think the answer is to force positivity, to convince themselves to feel better, to repeat affirmations they don't believe. But that doesn't work, because the problem was never a lack of positive thoughts. The problem was a deeply conditioned emotional standard that your mind keeps returning to. You don't raise that by pretending, you raise it by training. Slowly, deliberately, repeatedly. It starts with something simple but uncomfortable, allowing yourself to experience a level of calm or happiness that feels unfamiliar without immediately questioning it, without analyzing it, without preparing for it to disappear. This is harder than it sounds, because your instinct will be to interrupt it, to bring yourself back down to what feels normal. But instead, you stay with it, even if it feels strange, even if part of you doesn't trust it, you stay. And over time, that unfamiliar state begins to feel less foreign. This is how the limit expands. Not through intensity, but through consistency. You also begin to discipline your internal dialogue, not by silencing your thoughts, but by refusing to automatically agree with them. When your mind says, this won't last, you notice it, but you don't follow it. When it says, something will go wrong, you observe it, but you don't build a story around it. You stop feeding the patterns that keep pulling you back, and gradually they lose strength. At the same time, you raise your emotional standards, not in terms of what you demand from the world, but in terms of what you tolerate within yourself. You stop normalizing constant tension. You stop accepting restlessness as your default state. You stop identifying with every anxious reaction as if it defines you. Instead, you begin to expect a different baseline, one built on steadiness, clarity, and control. This is not about becoming someone else. It is about removing what was never truly you to begin with, the conditioning, the limitations, the patterns you inherited and repeated without question. And as you do this, something subtle begins to change. You no longer feel the need to sabotage moments of peace. You no longer feel uncomfortable when things are going well. You no longer feel like happiness is something fragile that needs to be protected or questioned. It becomes something stable, something you can hold without tension. And that is the real shift, not in what you have, but in what you can sustain. Because at the end of the day, your life will always rise to the level of what you can consistently hold without rejecting. And once you expand that, everything else begins to follow. At the end of all this, everything comes back to a single, uncomfortable truth. You were never as limited by your life as you thought. You were limited by what you believed you could feel within it. You thought happiness was something to chase, something to earn, something that would arrive once enough things went your way. But now you can see it differently. You can see that it was never about accumulation. It was about permission. Permission you never realized you were withholding from yourself. For years, maybe your entire life, you have been living inside an invisible boundary, not imposed by the world, not enforced by other people, but maintained by your own mind. A line that quietly decided how calm you're allowed to feel, how fulfilled you're allowed to be, how stable your inner world is allowed to become. And every time life tried to offer you more than that, you resisted it. Not consciously, not intentionally, but consistently. Because anything beyond that line did not feel like you. And the mind will always choose what feels like you over what is actually good for you. This is why nothing outside ever fully worked. Not because it wasn't enough, but because you couldn't hold it, you couldn't stay in it, you couldn't accept it without tension, without doubt, without pulling yourself back down. But now, something has changed. You can see the line. You can feel it when it shows up. In the moments where things are good, but your mind starts searching for what's wrong. In the moments where you feel peace, but something inside you tries to interrupt it. In the moments where life feels stable, but you feel the urge to disrupt it, that is the line. And the moment you see it, it is no longer invisible. And when it is no longer invisible, it is no longer absolute. This is where your power begins. Not in forcing yourself to be happy, not in chasing a different life, but in no longer automatically obeying the limit you've been living under, in allowing yourself, moment by moment, to remain in states that once felt unfamiliar, to not immediately collapse back into old patterns just because they feel comfortable, to not believe every thought that tries to pull you back to who you used to be. This is not a dramatic transformation. It is quiet. It is slow. It is almost invisible from the outside. But internally, it changes everything. because you are no longer reacting from the same conditioned place. You are no longer living inside the same boundaries. You are expanding what you can hold. And as that expands, your experience of life expands with it. Not because the world changed, but because you did. And eventually, something very simple but very powerful becomes true. You stop asking, why am I not happy yet? And you start realizing, I was never missing anything. The only thing that was ever missing was the willingness to let yourself have what was already there. And if you truly understand this, then you also understand something even deeper. This was never really about happiness. It was about control. Not control over the world, but control over your inner world. Because the moment you stop outsourcing your emotional state to circumstances, everything changes. You are no longer waiting. You are no longer negotiating with life, hoping it will finally give you permission to feel at peace. You take that responsibility back. And that is where most people hesitate. Because it is easier to believe that something outside is missing than to accept that nothing is missing, but you have been holding yourself back. It is easier to blame timing than to confront your own patterns. Easier to chase than to sit still and observe. But once you cross that line, you cannot go back to not seeing it. You begin to notice it everywhere, in the way you react to small inconveniences, in the way you anticipate problems before they exist, in the way you interrupt your own peace with unnecessary thoughts, and instead of following those patterns automatically, you begin to choose differently, not perfectly, not all at once, but consciously. You allow moments of silence without filling them. You allow moments of stability without questioning them. You allow moments of happiness without bracing for loss. And in doing so, you slowly become someone who is no longer governed by the same internal limits. Someone who does not need constant stimulation to feel okay. Someone who does not collapse when things are uncertain. Someone who does not sabotage what is good just because it feels unfamiliar. This is what real inner strength looks like. It is quiet, it is steady, it does not announce itself, but it is unshakable. Because it is not dependent on what happens, it is rooted in how you choose to respond to what happened. And over time, this creates a completely different life. Not necessarily in what you have, but in how you experience everything you have. The same day feels different, the same challenges feel different, the same moments of stillness feel deeper, more complete, more real, because you are no longer filtering them through the same limitations. You are no longer resisting them. You are finally allowing them. And that is the shift most people spend their entire lives chasing without ever finding. Not more, not better, not different. Just free.